I'm with you. Okay. Am I the first to speak? Okay.
Test, test. Yeah, all good. So good morning, everyone. So we invite you to take your seat. We're gonna start very shortly. So please come as well around the table, have a seat. We'll kick it off in 1 minute. There are also some seats here at the front next to me, so don't be shy. And over there on the corner, so please come around the table. So good morning, everyone, and it is my honor to welcome you today. So here in Brussels and as well online for our participants for this Future Africa-Europe Strategic Roundtable. So my name is Holly Ranevozanani. I'm the Deputy Executive Director of the Africa-Europe Foundation, and it is my pleasure to moderate today's conversation, a conversation that we know it's very much well-timed because when a majority of the world's population go to polls, including 1/3 of African countries, and the EU elections that just took place, I think this is the time where we need to shape the appetite, but as well the direction for international cooperation. And we all know that finance is a big part of that conversation. In particular, we see that the UN Agenda 2030 or the AU Agenda 2063 are facing finance gaps, and that is estimated anywhere between 900 billion and 1.3 trillion a year dollars in Africa, and that also with existing external finance sources that falling short of this target, with net bilateral official development assistance flows to Africa decreasing to $34 billion in 2022. So more than ever, it's very important that we look together collectively at these financing issues and also to build together this operation blueprint for the Africa-Europe partnership in the coming years and rethink, address collectively a couple of points. Of course, looking at the strategic areas that hold most promise for impactful cooperation between Africa and Europe, but as well looking at the low-hanging fruit to accelerate the implementation of our shared sustainable development goals. So today's conversation will definitely pave the way for a paradigm shift toward a strengthened, reinforced partnership between Africa and Europe, and that is underpinned, obviously, by this transformative cooperation on finance, and also moving from this outdated donor-recipient model to a win-win partnership. So it will also build on yesterday's session that we have with youth from Africa and Europe that made it very clear about their expectations for the common future, and they have voiced their choices. So before kicking off this conversation, just a couple of housekeeping points. If you're in the room, please just raise your hands. So my colleagues will come to you if you have any questions, reaction, etc. And online, please raise as well your virtual hand, and we'll bring you in. And when you do intervene, please do introduce yourself for the benefit of everyone. So to kick off today's conversation, it is my honor to first give the floor to the Africa-Europe Foundation's co-presidents, President Mary Robinson, Chair of the Elders and former President of Ireland, and as well President Ellen Johnson-Sirleaf, former President of Liberia, to provide their opening perspectives on priorities and strategic topics for this Africa-Europe partnership. So starting first with President Robinson, so floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and good morning, dear friends. I would prefer to be with you in person, but I'm happy to greet you by Zoom. As you mentioned, 2024 is the year of elections for so many countries, and more recently, at the European Union level as well. South Africa, has had its own elections and now has its government of national unity, having been forced by the electorate to form a coalition with other political groupings. The three Sahelian states of Mali, Faso, and Niger have broken away from the West African national group ECOWAS, saying that this is the only way they can establish their national sovereignty. The United Kingdom has a centre-left government, which is more likely to be present and engaged in global climate and finance questions. As we saw last weekend, the French population has refused to let the far-right Rassemblement National into government. And in the United States, Joe Biden's presidential campaign looks very wobbly at a time when having a credible, effective challenger to Donald Trump and everything he stands for is terribly important for all of us. So these are worrying times because we have no time to lose. Will France be able to follow South Africa's example and forge a new government because of the times that are in it? And will the new European Parliament and indeed the new College of Commissioners rise to the challenges of the moment? I've recently become one of 20 or so guardians of the planetary boundaries. And I spent a week at the end of May in Brazil, in part with Johan Rockström and Carlos Nobre and others, as they updated us on the climate and nature crisis, the science. It is really scary. They made it clear that we have 5.5 years up to 2030 to put into effect and indeed increase the decisions and commitments we have made over recent years, but failed to live up to, failed to implement. This moment is therefore urgent. It is also a once-in-a-lifetime moment to reshape relations between Europe and Africa in ways which respect the difficult history, traces of which are still too visible today. My fellow honorary president and fellow panelist, Ellen Johnson-Sirleaf, kindly sent me a talk she gave to the Africa-Europe Foundation in 2019. And I agree with everything she said in that. Not much has changed, alas. We see this, for example, in the pattern of trade. African countries continue to export commodities in their raw form, while Europe exports manufactured goods to them. And we see it in the pattern of policymaking. The EU makes decisions about trade policy, like CBAM and the Deforestation Directive, without engaging with African countries beforehand to see how such measures could bring multiple benefits rather than potential losses. As the AEF report, Financing Our Future, just issued, makes clear, we need to increase the volume of money within the system. There is a large gap between the scale of the problem and the amounts of investment currently mobilized to fix it. And the promises of money need to be accessible. Many countries find it too difficult to go through the multiple bureaucratic hoops to gain access to the money which is meant for them. There is no single source of finance on which we can rely. Rather, I believe we need to push for all of the options, whether it's increasing the investment flows from multilateral development banks, upping development assistance budgets, expanding domestic resource mobilization, and tapping into private investment funds, including pension and insurance reserves. I know the Africa-Europe Foundation has been particularly active in getting a better grip on illegal financial flows and ways for both continents to stem and rechannel such flows. And I commend the working group you have established on this topic. At our Women Leaders Network, we've been discussing the multiple potential sources of investment funds and how to get more money into each of them. We've also been keen to support the proposals being interrogated by the Global Tax Task Force, co-led by one of our members, Laurence Tubiana. She and her team are exploring new ways of mobilizing finance, especially by taxing carbon-related activities, such as aviation, the aviation levy, a tax on maritime fuels, and a tax on fossil fuel extraction or windfall profits tax. The great advantage of such new global taxes would be their additionality and their role in taxing carbon. If we're to respond effectively to the urgency of now, these investment flows need to be ambitious, visible, and credible. They need to transform energy access across Africa, strengthen adaptation actions, especially at local level, build infrastructure, and get agriculture food systems delivering diverse and nutritious foods. Nothing happens without finance, whether we like it or not. And the scale of investment required means all sources have to be tapped. From our discussions at the Women Leaders Network, my priorities would be first to push hard on increasing SDRs for the redistribution to climate vulnerable countries. Luckily, we have several WLN members well placed to take this on, including Kristalina Georgieva herself. Second, we must get more investment flowing to small-scale energy enterprise, often run by women, for clean cooking and other energy systems. I was at the Clean Cooking Summit, as I know a number of you were, and we learned that it would take only 4 billion over the next 4 years to solve that problem. Where is the political will? Again, we have key figures like Yvonne Aki-Sawyer on the local level, Mayor of Freetown, who knows how to get local activities done and funded. And third, we should be putting our weight behind the work of the Global Task Force, the Global Tax Task Force, so that they can deliver workable options for from now and on to COP30. I've been very interested in what the youth have been saying, and I like their optimism and their hope. And I will end by saying, this is the time, 2024 is the time for Europe and Africa finally to carve out this special partnership of equality in their relationship. It's time to do it now, because their time is of the essence. We have no time to spare, and money is at the heart of it. And Europe must drive in every place where it has a seat at the table that is important. It must drive the importance of increasing the amounts and increasing them with a focus on Africa. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, President Robinson, also for reminding us about pushing all the options for the urgency of now. President Johnson-Sirleaf, I would like to bring you in as well. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you and good morning to all. I will be brief, as Mary has already covered all that needs to be said. Today, the world is facing a confused state in which geopolitical rivalry is now leading to wars. Resources have been drained that have affected multilateralism and global cooperation. This has also affected Africa. Africa today is under great pressure to be able to respond to the needs of the young people, to be able to have a leadership that practices better good governance, and to demand that those left behind, like women, will be more recognized and will be given more opportunity to ensure gender equity. This is a time when Europe and Africa can form a true partnership, a partnership based upon historical cooperation, historical culture, tradition, geography, in what has enabled the bilateral arrangements between Europe and Africa to have lasted so long. And we all admit that in all of this, Africa was shortchanged, in that the resources of Africa were exploited. And today, we find ourselves still dependent upon our bilateral relationship, Europe and elsewhere. And more importantly, the partnership between Europe and Africa has been affected as Africa sought to go beyond that partnership and seek relationships elsewhere. So today you have China, Russia are also penetrating, ensuring that given this rivalry that exists, that they will find footing and partnership in Africa. And this also affects this long-standing partnership with us. What can we do? I think Miri has pointed to the need for the scaling of resources. Resources for our regional institutions to ensure that they can tackle the development needs that we need. Africa has its responsibility in this regard. Africa has to also improve its tax systems and ensure that those commercial relationships with European countries can be looked at to make sure that private institutions pay their just due. We would like to see, as one of the partnership arrangements, is to take our continental free trade agreement, which Africa uses as its key pivot in pushing things, to make sure that we tackle this infrastructure problem. The lack of power. 800 million people in Africa don't have electricity. We cannot develop our industries unless we have that infrastructure with the power, transportation, railway, roads, so that Africa becomes competitive and becomes a true partner to Europe. We believe that the private sector, which has not been very dominant in many of the vision and the agenda of African countries, now needs to be looked at as the instrument that can be used. More private capital is needed in Africa. We need to find a means of de-risking this capital. And this would take effort on the part of both Africa to ensure that we manage our own resources properly, and that the private sector will work for forming the means whereby we can ensure that this is done. Let me close by saying we need a real dialogue. A dialogue in which the policies of Europe, of all the European countries, can be discussed in such a way that we can know in this partnership, in the flow of resources, the conditions, the terms of those are clearly discussed in this dialogue so that they are aligned with the vision and agenda of Africa. I hope that those meetings held in Brussels, when we bring together the leaders of Africa with the leaders of Europe, that these particular issues can be discussed in a real form of dialogue in which we all have said that we need to be equals. Equals in taking responsibility, but also equal in the benefits that come from this relationship. Thank you.
Thank you very much, President Johnson Sirleaf, and also for highlighting the need that it's high time to respond on the needs of the young people. And yesterday, indeed, we gathered some youth from Africa and Europe to discuss the very same topic on priorities and sustainable finance. And I would like to bring in David Arinze to actually get your reaction and share as well some perspective from yesterday. David, over to you.
Can you hear me? Fantastic. Thank you so much, Holly, for the introduction. Good morning, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen here. It's a pleasure to contribute to this discourse and this roundtable. I really want to thank the organizers and the Africa Europe Foundation for creating such a platform for youth to engage on such a meaningful discussion, share ideas, our contributions, and really narrow down our interventions across, or our thoughts across a couple key areas, which I will just share with us at this time. We're able to identify that investment in energy, transportation, and digital infrastructure is critical. We also went on to discuss the importance of energy transition and why it has to be done in a fair, just, and equitable manner. We also considered green energy transition, including supporting the implementation of set resource mobilization strategies that needs to impact the continent in a more granular scale and ensure that the fulfillment of relevant pledges that have already been made are achieved, and also the effectiveness and the monitoring and effectiveness of the use of these resources. We also discussed this digital transformation and why it's important, because it supports connectivity through investments and also enhances digital and data economy while boosting digital economic entrepreneurship skills. We also discussed the need for sustainable growth and decent job creation by investing in youth-owned businesses in Africa. Also, we looked at this critical issue of human development and human capacity development for youths. We cannot really talk about a collaboration between Europe and Africa and leveraging the youths in these two continents without the subject of capacity building. Most of what we've had prior to now has been more of a consumer, where Africa is seen as a consumer continent and Europe is seen as a producer continent. And part of the things that we discussed, that is important that we begin to see some level of equity across both continents, where we're not just talking about production on one hand and consumption on the other, but the new term I'd like to call prosumer, where Africa and Europe can agree to both produce and consume, creating a very equitable relationship for both parties. We also recognize the role of education in strengthening the ecosystem and strengthening the youths, capacity building, patient capital, and resources. There's also a need to ensure that you achieve investor readiness, especially for youth-led initiatives. As you'd agree with me in the room, if you have investors in the room, nobody wants to throw his or her money down the toilet. And so you want to be able to ensure that your investment lead to much more productive output. But again, that's a gap, because people need to be, companies, youths need to be equipped on what it means to even build investment-ready engagements or businesses or projects so that they can be better supported to do what they know how to do best. I'd like to also mention that empowering youth, young people in financial discussions is essential. It fosters the economic participation and dismantles traditional Europe-Africa dynamics. I'd like to say here, Europe and Africa need each other. We all must effectively collaborate in designing the future that we seek. We must consciously recognize the power of youth in shaping the future that we all seek. Our humanity binds us, and it's important to note that youth should be included every step of the way of the decision-making process. If you want that sense of ownership, if you want that sense of thoughtfulness, if you want that sense of resilience, youth must be included across the way. And so one of the things that I would say from the youth session that we had yesterday and going forward is, we invite you today to engage and leverage youth in shaping the future that we seek. In order for us to achieve the results that we seek, leverage youth as that capacity bank across sides, providing avenues for improved education, providing avenues for capacity building, providing avenues for patient capital and investment into these entities that are driven, that are led, and are run by youth. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, David, indeed. And I think the Africa-Europe partnership, as you rightly mentioned, indeed will be shaped first and foremost by its people. And that partnership requires stronger cooperation across both continents. Europe needs Africa, and Africa needs Europe. So on this note, I would like to give the floor to our partners. So Rosa Balfour, Director, Carnegie Europe, Zainab Usman, Director of the Africa Program, Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and as well David McNair, Executive Director of Global Policy at One Campaign, to really introduce us the new essay series being launched today, and which tell us a little bit more as well about the strategic priorities for this win-win partnership. So maybe if I may kick off with you, Rosa, to give the floor. Over to you.
Thank you very much. I'd just like to welcome you all to this discussion today. I have quite a hard act to follow, so let me just say a few words. I think I'm going to organize them around the sort of pessimism of the mind and optimism of the will, which is a Gramsci quote. We have, and it was mentioned by several speakers, we are in the midst of an electoral year, and the election results in Europe paint a very mixed picture as far as thinking about the future relationship between Europe and Africa. 1/4 of the votes in the European Parliament went to radical right parties. These are parties that are poorly inclined towards the rest of the world, to put it euphemistically. That they're parties that have reached success on a anti-migration platform. There are parties that have been pushing for slashing development aid budgets. And of course, around 1/4 of European Union member states are run by these parties. So important donors such as Sweden have slashed their development aid budget, and the Netherlands will follow the latest radical right coalition government that has been formed. So on these bases, there is little scope, perhaps, for optimism. But I think in these contexts, ingenuity is also triggered. And I think this is partly the story that we saw in France over the last few weeks, in which the radical right made huge gains in the electorate, but it also triggered a response on part of other political parties and other political forces and citizens of France to try and prevent the radical right from coming into power, and that was successful. So what kind of ingenuity can we think about? The report points this out very clearly. I mean, there is no alternative to understanding the demographic challenges, the demographic changes, the direction of travel. There is no alternative to understanding the climate challenges and the need for partnership, the need for identifying common global common goods and forming coalitions around them to pursue those global commons. And I think some of the things that have been mentioned here today, the role of women, the role of youth, are absolutely central to identifying how to govern these global commons. And I think the European Union, for all its faults and all its political challenges at the moment, is actually an appropriate space in which this type of policy entrepreneurship can be developed. This is an organization which allows multiple diverse coalitions to pursue policy entrepreneurship and to set the agenda in a way which perhaps is different from that advocated by the radical right that has been doing so well in the elections. So it's important to identify those coalition potentials. And I think in addition to this, I would like to add that in many respects, the European Union and its leadership is is going through a self-reflective period, having been knocked off its pedestal in the wake of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and discovering that the rest of the world had somewhat different views about the EU as a force for good, and is going through a reflective period. And it is perhaps the opportune moment to contribute to trying to understand what kind of renewed role Europe can pursue globally. There continue to be blind spots. The impact of CBAM and has been mentioned as one of them in, you know, the failure of diplomacy, of European diplomacy to engage with partners. But I think at the same time, there is a force in a search for recognition of where those blind spots are. So again, the EU provides that type of space for this kind of entrepreneurship. So that's where I think I would like to end my remarks. Pessimism of the mind, in the sense that the analysis is not, does not give much scope for optimism, but optimism of the will, because there still remains space in the EU and in the way it's organized. Thank you.
Very much, Rosa. So, Zainab, over to you.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Zainab Usman. I'm the director of the Africa program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and I'm Rosa's colleague. She is based here in Brussels, leading the Carnegie Europe division of our very large entity, so to speak. It's really a pleasure to be here and to partner with a variety of other entities involved in this convening today. The Africa-Europe Foundation, Friends of Europe, the One Campaign, the Mo Ibrahim Foundation, and others. Thank you for bringing together this esteemed group of thought leaders, policy stakeholders, and also decision makers. I'm going to take a slightly different approach here. Rather than focus on the substance of our conversations, I think both Rosa and excellencies from Ireland and Liberia have already done. I want to tell you a little bit more about the work we do at the Africa program at Carnegie in DC, why we take the approach that we are taking, and why this conversation today is very, very instrumental to not just our work, but to a lot of the challenges plaguing our world today, and indeed the opportunities that lie in addressing those challenges. Since its inception about 4 years ago, the Africa program at the Carnegie Endowment has been focused on work at the intersection of foreign policy and economic development as it relates to Africa, because this is an area where we see a gap in global policies and discourse as they relate to the continent in terms of understanding the realities on the ground, the challenges that exist, but also the vast multitudes of opportunities for everyone really around the world. And it is within this analytical framework that we produce work and research, but also convene policymakers, policy stakeholders, scholars, and others for meaningful policy dialogues. Our stream of work on Africa's external relations is a very, very important thread here. And the focus is on the implications for Africa and vice versa of the changing external strategies of major global actors, the role of African countries in global governance, institutions, and then also how subnational dynamics often transcend national borders. So this is work that we continue to do. We're obviously based in the US, so a lot of our work is US focused, but what we're doing today is also having a conversation with respect to Europe broadly, the European Union specifically. We're also working on Asia with respect to Asia-Africa relations, China-Africa relations being central here, but also other parts of Asia, and then of course the Middle East. We also believe that the salience of African voices in global governance conversations cannot be understated. In fact, the issue of voice and representation has become very, very important recently on a range of global issues, be they climate change, mobilization of development financing, global health, pandemics, conflict, security issues, etc. And it is with this mindset that the work that David McNair has led on examining the status of Africa-Europe relations and analyzing the opportunities that exist for partnerships became very, very important. So the work that he's going to present shortly on why Europe needs Africa, and in a way, even with the title, you can see that we try to be somewhat subversive a little bit to kind of flip the normal direction of the conversation, which is that Africa needs help and support and assistance and charity, but to make it clear that the African continent is actually a very important part of the world. It has always been, actually, and that Europe, with also its own challenges, but also its own opportunities and solutions, needs the continent as much as the continent needs Europe. It's a reason why we kind of flipped the direction of the conversation. But this series really brings together various scholars, thinkers, even policy makers to identify specific areas where the relationship between the two continents can be reimagined. Trade policy, migration policy, climate change, climate action, the energy transition, development financing, and a range of other topics. And obviously this conversation is very timely, as we've heard from my colleague Rosa. Political changes afoot here in Europe, but also on the African continent. I'm sure a lot of us are tracking developments in West Africa and the Sahel that are evolving on a daily basis in East Africa, in Kenya, South Africa with elections. In fact, a number of elections have been very disruptive, to say the least. But also the global economy itself is undergoing significant shifts. A lot of countries around the world are still recovering from the scarring effects of COVID-19. Supply chains are in disarray. Various countries around the world are putting up trade barriers for a variety of reasons, national security, for building up their own domestic competitiveness. So there's just a lot that is in flux right now, affecting both continents, both Europe and Africa. So it is really within this context that obviously this conversation becomes very important and very timely. I'm now going to hand over to David McNair, and as you know, he's the Executive Director for Global Policy at the One Campaign, but he also has an affiliation with us as a non-resident scholar at the Carnegie Endowment, and he will be leading this conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Zainab, and thank you to the Africa Europe Foundation and Carnegie and the One Campaign for convening this. As we've heard already, the outlook is dark. We've had some great news in the past week from the UK and France. But if you look at the kind of broader picture, we're seeing fragmentation and we're seeing Europe facing a series of threats from within and from without. Ukraine, China, the specter of a Trump White House, populism internally. And in some respects, you could forgive European policymakers for saying, actually, we've got too much on our agenda, we're going to deprioritize Africa. The argument we're making with this report is if you look at the long-term trends and the data, that would be a strategic mistake. Europe is aging, it's going grey, and that's having a series of implications for fiscal policy, for productivity, That aging issue is already affecting European countries' credit ratings. Africa is the youth hub of the world. It will add 796 million people to the global workforce by 2050. Europe wants to be a climate leader. Africa has 60% of the world's solar potential, 70% of platinum production, 70% cobalt, huge reserves of both natural and human capital. Europe's economy is sluggish. If you read the Letter report, it was pretty shocking. A third of the European population live in areas that are, quote unquote, slowly left behind. Africa has a growing dynamism to its economy. McKinsey estimates that the consumer potential in the next decades is about 3 trillion. And of course, artificial intelligence will kind of pose threats and kind of, in a sense, shake up the way that our economies operate and create new industries. Creativity will become more and more important. And if you look at the creative industries coming out of Nigeria on music, coming out of Senegal and Sierra Leone on fashion, these industries are going global, and there are potentials there for kind of collaboration and for kind of reshaping the future economy coming out of creativity. So part of what we did was we convened these 8 thought leaders from both continents to look at a series of different themes. And in a moment, you'll hear from Hassan Damluji, who will talk about finance and particularly moving from development cooperation to what he describes as circular cooperation, where everyone pays in, everyone has a say. But critically, in an era of massive disruption, the key will be focusing on learning from one another rather than just transferring financial resources. You'll hear from Marta Foresti, who will talk about reframing the migration debate, moving away from debates about keeping people out and instead reforming the visa system so that we can focus on creating spaces of creativity and innovation. We also have analysis from Jane Munga, who's here in the room, who will talk about the idea of creating digital single markets and the regulatory investments that could be made in order to stimulate private investment, increase connectivity, and spur the digital economy. A number of the authors are not in the room, so David Luke from LSE has talked a lot about the way in which European trade policy could support regional integration in Africa, in line with Agenda 2063. It currently doesn't, and there's a kind of collision course coming, so he makes the case that that could be shifted. We're talking a lot about remittances, and we have an essay looking at both reducing remittance costs, but the way in which remittances could also be factored into countries' credit ratings, and as a result, reduce the cost of capital, which is such a problematic issue when it comes to the debt issues. So we got a range of different issues, but as I started out, the kind of whole idea is that it is a strategic mistake if we put Africa down the list in Europe's priorities. We need to invest, we need to think differently, we need to put new issues on the agenda that not only respond to the needs of African countries, but also are win-wins for the people that are left behind and are voting for populist parties in Europe. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. And indeed, we'll come back into these different areas for collaboration that has been highlighted in the report that you have here on the table. And before that, I would like to talk a little bit maybe around these untapped opportunities of collaboration that we haven't heard yet, and that is around oceans and blue economy. And that's also an area that really brings promises for the Africa-Arab Partnership, notably when we look at oceans and its wide-ranging nature, looking at climate regulation, food security, job creation, biodiversity, and so on. I think it's great also to look a little bit into that angle. So I'm delighted to welcome online Nancy Karigi-Tu, who is AEF co-chair on Africa-Europe Working Group on Oceans in Blue Economy, but as well Kenya's Special Envoy on Blue Economy. So Nancy, please share your thoughts on these opportunities for the partnership, and the floor is yours. Nancy, are you with us? It's okay. I'll bring you probably later on if there is any connectivity issue on this. What we heard as well over and over again, that we need changes when we talk about this Africa-Europe partnership. And we, again, I think were emphasized by Zainab, but as well by Rosa, about the role of youth. So as yesterday, within the conversation that we have, obviously we talked around geopolitics, around the change of leadership and what it means for the partnership. So maybe before looking at the different issues that was mentioned by David, but looking at mobility, migration, digital transformation, and the circular actually cooperation that is quite interesting. I'd like to bring you in, Jonas, for your thoughts and really bringing back some of the conversation on the youth before we deep dive into the core issues of the report. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Holly, and thanks everyone for the already very interesting remarks. I will try to summarize our discussion from yesterday, which was surrounding a lot of topics on geopolitics within the next 2 or 3 minutes. And as we heard before, I'm, I guess, also the representative who needs to spread some hope and optimism here. So I will try my best to do that within the interesting discussions that we had yesterday. So first of all, I think what we can also share, and what was also a big part of our discussion yesterday, was the topic on political will that was also ensured by President Robinson, that we said, especially as young people, we also need the political will to transition these youth voices, not only in the silos, but also get them into like the decision-making spaces that we have. So if we, for example, look back to the last EU-Africa summit, we had the big problem that we, as the youth summit, were basically separately taking place from the main discussions on the next day. And I think what's already happening here is a big improvement, that we have these structural dialogues way ahead of the next summit, so that that can really feed into what we believe is also important for young people. And what I would like to emphasize also is what Logan said yesterday, that we need to really like think about that the change needs to happen outside of Addis and Brussels, and that we need to really like bring in people that are not the usual ones that are sitting in Brussels or in Addis at the decision-making table. And to maybe like summarize a little bit also our discussion yesterday, and to bring in some of our thoughts that we had, especially also speaking from a more EU perspective, is that the EU needs to, especially after the elections, also bring in more of a perspective that is less transactional, and really goes into a proper understanding of the EU-Africa relationship. And what we came up with ideas with was especially a mentorship system, that you have a mix and match system between the African continent and the EU, where you bring people together on both sides, because I think also, I see Rock here and me, we had like a long discussion about that as well, how to basically make both sides in the institutions and in the youth angle profit from this. And I think that would be a good and innovative system. But we also had the discussion, for example, that there's a new scramble for Africa. And I think the big problem here is also that other countries such as China, Japan, Turkey are seeing Africa more as an opportunity, while we in Europe see Africa often as a challenge. And I think that's also a mindset that needs to change. And I think if we include young people in this, then we have a really good chance to actually move forward with that. With regard to that, I think also when you look, for example, into the new parliament, you have again the big problem that you have a lot of young people not on the list for the political parties. So if you want innovation in the parliaments and in the political groups, then you also need to put young people on the list and into the parliament and into the decision-making bodies. And we had a big discussion yesterday about youth quotas, and this is of course also something that we need to continue over the next months, how to really also bring young people on a localized level. Maybe two really practical takeaways from yesterday. One was mentioned by Emma, which was a design thinking workshop where really people in Geneva talked about sustainable inclusion and bringing young people via a mentorship system together, from the expertise and from the young or the youth representative angle. And I think a second one, what is also really useful, is kind of like an AU-EU youth lab that was talked about, and where you really like bring people together on the key problems where you need young people to talk to each other, and also connect them afterwards to, for example, the intergenerational dialogue that we need to have around several of topics. So for example, we talked about migration, we talked about democracy, we talked about human rights, And I think what I can close with maybe is what Ellen Johnson Sirleaf said, that we need a real dialogue. And if you want that, then you need to bring young people to the table, and you need to not only develop more and more youth engagement mechanism, but also transition these and the knowledge that we have into real engagement. Thank you.
Many thanks, Jonas, for this great recap of the conversation. So I'll encourage everyone from now, if you have any comments, reactions, questions as well, to raise your hand and mic will circulate, and same as well online to raise their virtual hand. So while you think of your next questions and comments, so I'd like to bring in Marta Foresti, to kind of share a little bit the perspectives around the migration conversation, the mobility, the movement of the people between Africa and Europe. So over to you, Marta.
Thank you, and good morning, everyone. It's so nice to see so many familiar faces online and in the room. Thank you all for the introduction. And let me pick up some of the suggestions that I had from Mary Robinson, David, Zainab, and others, to really make a little bit of an effort to try to think outside the box, think a little bit of traditional ways of thinking about Africa-Europe relations. And I think I don't need to remind you that there is one issue, one topic that remains incredibly controversial, divisive, toxic, and really stands in the way of a more genuine, equal partnership between the two continents. It is the issues of migration and the sort of the, how much that label, that word, creates all the anxieties and all the worries and all the problems that we've seen over the years. And so with that in mind, and particularly with Zainab's encouragement to rethink a little bit the way we consider some of these issues in the relation between the two continents, David and I wrote an essay that tried to rethink and reframe this debate. And I would say the way I personally think about it, which can be maybe a little bit controversial, but we are here to try to do something new and different, is to recognize that we want to address and with time and gradually fix this problem of the inability of people to move between and often within the continents, is that we need to stop think about the solution as a matter of migration policy. And we need to look for the solutions where there are both low-hanging fruits, but also genuine sort of interest and opportunities, and to open doors and to change the way we think about the problem and therefore the solutions. And so in the essay, we propose fundamentally 3 ways in which we can rethink the mobility of people within and between the two continents, away from just a matter of borders between countries. The first is to think really hard about where people move to, and we know where that is. People move to cities, and cities is where a lot of the practical consequences of the movement of people comes to life. Mayor Akisori mentioned before by Mary Robinson, is a collaborator of the foundation, of the Africa Europe Foundation, and has been a real champion together with the mayor of Milan, Giuseppe Sala, to find very practical ways in which the fact that people move to cities is something that needs to be addressed by policymakers and politicians at the local level, from housing to waste management, to all sorts of other practical ways in which the movement of people affects urban living, reminding all of us that by 2030, 2/3 of all of us on the globe will move and live in cities. So look at cities and not at national level and not at borders for a solution. The second area, which again David mentioned, relates to the creative industries and creative sectors. And this to me really goes to the heart of this idea of reframing the narrative. We as in people who really understand and would like to make migration a reality for people in the two continents have been too often made mistakes when it comes to the narrative. We tried really hard to counter the toxic negative arguments with positive ones, trying to frame migration as a positive thing that, as we all know, has really not succeeded in sort of winning hearts and minds and creating a sense of not otherness, but all of us together sharing a common future. I cannot think of many other areas where the moment of interest that there is around creative industries from the African continent. We mentioned music, we mentioned fashion. I think about when the exhibition of Africa fashion opened here in London a couple of years ago, how well received it was. The Economist said fashion, is one of the key industries that will put Africa on the, even more on the global sphere. And so can we leverage this idea of beauty, the idea of talent, the idea of the movement, the people that goes along with the movement of fabrics, the movement of sounds, the poetics of borders, as some I started to think about. So away from, the traditional narratives around desperation, around death, obviously, but also some of the more, the one that focus simply on economic gains, which also have fallen short of trying to really bring this issue to the fore. And so to really, look into the creatives and the connection between the creatives on both continents to create meaningful connections and spaces of innovation. But all of this leads to the third area, which is where I think there is a real opportunity, and what I think we mentioned earlier on, the low-hanging fruits, to really start to make a difference in practice and create reform space. And that's visas. Hopefully some of you would have seen, if anything, on social media that I've been slightly obsessed with visas in the last year or so, and a lot has now sort of come out of analysis that looks at the visa regimes, deliberately not the visas that relate to migration. So here we're not talking about visas of people who apply for sort of for work permits and plan to migrate, but particularly the short-term visas, those designed to facilitate the very normal movement of people for holiday, for business, for visiting friends and family across borders, and what can be done and how that works. And the analysis of the short-term Schengen visas from the last few years shows a real, problem with inequality, particularly the way it affects African nationals, African countries. For some countries, including major economies and allies of Europe, Nigeria, Senegal, Ghana, the rejection rates of the short-term, temporary, sort of 3 months business visitors visas for Schengen reaches 40-50%, both in 2022 and 2023. Which was a big surprise for me and for a number of journalists that, would not have assumed that the rejection rates were so high. The rejection rate goes hand in hand with GDP. So fundamentally, the poorer the countries, the higher the rejection rates for temporary visas, which again created some interesting reactions in the media about, well, what a surprise. And I think, why is it? Why is it that, if you apply for a business visa from a country like Nigeria, you should have 40% chances of that not being accepted, compared to, an equivalent submission from other countries around the world. In 2023, this analysis of rejection rates, we've also added some elements about the cost. And here we're thinking just very simply about the cost of applications and what happens with this level of unequal rates. And what we found is a really staggering figure of about 130 million euros of lost fees. So the fees that when you apply for a visa and it's not rejected, so the cost of those rejections overall globally for Schengen visas, short-term visas, is 130 million. 100 of those millions are just for Africa and Asia. And if you take into account the fact that there are so many more applications from Asia than there are from Africa, that once again disproportionately affects African countries. And I began to think about this cost as reverse remittances. We often hear about the flow of remittances from sort of countries in Europe to Africa of those who have migrated, and we rarely think about these costs that in a way flow the other way from applicants who do not see their opportunities to travel recognized and therefore lose those application fees. And that's just obviously the tip of the iceberg, as you can imagine what it means if you've booked flights, if you booked a holiday, if you need to attend a conference, if you're meant to play at a concert. And I'm very pleased that this, this work and with these figures, particularly around the cost of this application, has really, caught the imagination and the attention of audiences, particularly in countries that are most affected. So in Nigeria, this figure of, I think, is more than 5 million euros for Nigeria alone every year. There are the costs of the rejected visas. And the reason why this matters is it can so easily be fixed. There is no reason in the world why, countries like Nigeria, Ghana, and Senegal should not be allowed to apply, to have, the opportunity to travel for a festival or for a business conference, for an academic conference, the same ways it can be done from other parts of the world. The visa regimes are designed to be reciprocal, and they should be reciprocal. And so we fairly straightforward for the European Union to agree on some targets to reduce this high level of inequality on visa rejections, and for example, to aim for reducing the rejection rates from 40% towards, year on year, to make them more aligned, and to aim for a more equal system where countries applying from different parts of the world could have similar levels of acceptance and rejection rates. The cost of short-term visa application have recently increased from 80 euros to 90 euros, so there will be a further increase in those costs of the rejection rates. And this all affects very practically the lives of so many of us, not just them. So it's also a very practical way to make, to move away from the traditional narrative around, the migrants being them and the people who stay being us, so to speak, and to really think about this, about all of us who need to travel for work and leisure, which is an experience that we all share. It's been interesting to see, particularly how these problems with visa inequality affects, for example, the very African talented creatives that travel to Europe for and within Africa, because there is a major problem which we will start to look into very soon on visa regimes within Africa, of course. And for example, how many of the musicians that travel to Europe every summer for festivals are reduced because of visa inequality. We've had Lem Sisay from Ethiopia, who is a very prominent poet here in the UK, talk about the humiliation that him and others have suffered as a result of visa rejections. We heard of DJs that traveled to Glastonbury. Glastonbury, the big music festival in the UK, a couple of weeks ago, had 4 of the 5 African performers were from Nigeria. Rejection rates also to the UK, not just for Schengen, from Nigeria for visitors and business visa are over 40%. And as I said, I really think these are low-hanging fruits. We are not talking about necessarily migration-related visas. This is just the mobility of people for very, normal, normal purpose, normal as in, common experience purposes. It was a good way to start making a difference in seeing what are traditionally policies that politicians have such narrow space to try to address because of the rhetoric around it. I think there would be far less resistance, including, for example, some of the new elected governments in the UK, but also others in Europe, to begin at least to address and fix the visa regimes in ways that can create some genuine mutual benefits for those who need to visit, to go to academic conference, to go to festivals, to be tourists. And there is actually, narrative-wise, a real moment of opportunity as we speak. This year, the Venice Biennale is called Foreigners Everywhere. It focuses on the talent and on the contributions of artists from different parts of the world that often are not being represented in global festivals. And so we have a moment to try to really make the point that foreigners are everywhere, but foreigners need to be welcome, and welcome to visit festivals, to visit academic conference, to go on holiday, to be tourists, both within and across the 2 continents. And so I very much look forward to, working with some of you, hopefully, to try to really, take visa regimes on board as a very practical area for reform, both for Schengen visas and increasingly also to facilitate intra-Africa visa regime and travels. I think some of you would have heard somebody as important as Mr. Dangote say that he really struggles to get his visas to travel both within the continent and from across to Europe. And so surely this is something that is of mutual benefits on both sides of the Mediterranean. So looking forward to more discussions with you, but also practical action to fix this very practical and very fixable problem. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marta, for your intervention. So now looking at the floor here, the audience, any questions, reactions to what we've heard so far? So BRICS, okay, we'll take a couple of reactions, and then I think mics are circulating all over. So first BRICS here. Sorry.
Thank you very much. Good morning. My name is Briggs Bomba. I serve as the Director of Programs at Trust Africa. We are a Pan-African foundation headquartered in Dakar, Senegal, working across the continent. Martha's remarks, I just wanted to add one dimension to what she was speaking about in terms of visa inequality. This is a big issue that certainly has to be at the center of our conversations. So she spoke about the rejection rate as well as the cost. There's the other aspect of the bureaucracy that is in the system. And what surprises is that it seems to be a very consistent template, whichever European embassy you are visiting. So if I need to travel, just to get the appointment, you have to go online. And if I'm to try and book an appointment today, there are certain embassies, and that's actually the majority, they'll tell you that there are no appointments that are available. And then when you are lucky, the appointment will actually be 2 months from today, and sometimes longer. And this is a consistent template, and there's no phone call you can make, there's no person you can speak to, there's just like an automated response on the other end if you were to try and make a phone call. So there's really something that is happening in terms of a bottleneck that has been created that's just making it completely unpractical. Like most people will not mind actually paying the 100 euros to get the visa, but you just cannot secure the appointment for you to be able to travel. So that's something that really has to be, I think, something that we need to, bring into our conversations on cooperation. I like how Martha says this is fixable, because it is fixable, but we need to raise our voices. Then the second and last point that I wanted to speak to is it's a question of voice. Like, whose voice are we hearing when we are informing our strategies and our conversations on this Europe-Africa cooperation? I think when you look at Kenya, the recent couple of weeks, I had someone send a message from the US, well-meaning, they work on US-Africa policy, and they're like, this is surprising. We thought Kenya was the best economy in East Africa. It was the model in terms of democracy. So why these explosions? What is happening? So I think there is a way that we really need to make sure that we are tapping into some of the voices that are on the margins. When I studied economics in the US, I learned that the highest that unemployment was during the Great Depression was 25%. But if you look at a country like Kenya, youth unemployment is over 60%. So you're really talking of certain conditions that are quite desperate. But if we tap into just the elite conversations, even sometimes our leaders, there's a social distance between the leaders and especially these voices that are on the margins. So I think we need to be innovative. So I'm really happy to hear about the conversations on youth yesterday. We really need to be innovative when it comes to inclusion, like radical inclusion, really making sure that we are able to hear from as diverse a spectrum of voices as possible in terms of informing our conversations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Briggs. I'll bring in 2-3 more. If you can please introduce yourself and keep it brief, so as we have still lots to address. So over there, and then we'll go there. And Piera as well on this side. So please brief, straight to the point. Thank you very much.
I'll be brief.
Yeah, Filomena, over to you.
Filomena Pico, ECDPM. I head the AU relations work. Thank you, Martha, for a presentation. I want to even add another element on top of Briggs' element. So there's this phenomenon where sometimes Africans have to travel to a neighboring country to apply for the visa to go into Schengen. It's one Schengen area. Can the EU countries not have a system where they actually have to coordinate amongst themselves? I take an example of my aunt. She lives in Botswana but is Ugandan. And the embassy is in Pretoria. So she has to get a visa to South Africa first, to go to Pretoria to apply for Schengen to Netherlands. I mean, this is really extra costs for just Africans trying to come to Europe. So that's my main point. Can the Schengen countries not organize amongst themselves? There's a French embassy in Botswana and a German embassy. Can they not handle applications to the Netherlands, for example?
Thanks, Filomena. Piera, would you like to comment?
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much. Well, first of all, thank you so much for organizing this incredibly interesting and important discussion, and thank you to all the contributions and people we heard from so far. I think we do live in a time of increasing geopolitical tensions, and it would indeed be so powerful if Europe and Africa could really constitute a space of peace, a space of shared value, and of nature positive growth. And I think for that to happen, we really need to find new ways of working together. We need to find a new narrative. I really agree that we need to debunk that image of despair that is the commonplace so many times. I think we also need to change some of the things that hinder more effective partnerships at the global level. So I just would like to bring the example of the Paris Pact for People and the Planet. So I haven't introduced myself actually. My name is Piera Tortora, and I'm the head of the Paris Pact for People and the Planet Secretariat. The pact was endorsed last year. With the aim to reform the international financing system, knowing that it's not delivering for the people nor for the planet. The Paris Pact for People and the Planet now actually includes 56 countries. Many of them are African countries, so many countries around the table here are part of the pact. And also many European countries are part of it. And I think what is really beautiful about the pact is that many countries are using it to work together, to coalesce around specific topics that are key for reforming the international financing system. Topics like debt, topics like mobilizing private finance, topics around innovative sources. And you will hear in the next session, I guess, from my colleague Rachel, who works with Laurence Toubiana, and they lead the 4P task force on global levies. So the whole work that was also mentioned by Mary Robinson on how to mobilize additional financing from untapped resources like levies on aviation and others. So I just wanted to mention that this really need to focus on the financing and to establish new partnerships around it. And I think we're trying to do that through the 4P, and we really look at the Africa EU Foundation as a very valuable partner. So we very much look forward to continuing to be working with you and with all of you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Piera. So, Isabelle, can I bring you in?
Thank you. So I'm Isabelle Durand, and I am an expert for the Human Rights Council on right to development and former deputy of UNCTAD. Just I wanted to, we speak about dialogue, but the dialogue has to be supported by common interest first, and then respective benefit for on both sides. That's the basic issue. It's not just a moral duty or something like that. And I think that in order to have respective benefits, spillover effects, but also concrete results, especially for people and especially youth, I think that we have to avoid figures above 1 billion or more when you speak to people living with dozens. I think that sometimes we are really discussing on the future, but not on the concrete issues on the ground. So one of the tools could be a circular carbon diplomacy, because that's a common interest for all of us, climate change and carbon issue, but we have to manage that properly. And today, the question of carbon market is sometimes a little bit a forest of initiative without any rules or any requirement enough clear for all the stakeholders. And I think that working on that, not only carbon market, but carbon initiatives, not on a way, because I think that it was Mary Robinson mentioning CBAM, which is so bad perceived in Africa, because of course it was decided unilaterally in Brussels without enough cooperation and discussion with partners. So I think that working on that, that's really an innovative way to develop the traditional knowledge on a way which is really innovative. It helps also to have a relationship which is, of course, a way to support a proper initiative, regulatory initiative, a compliance with Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, which is so important to really implement that on the ground. So I think that Africa-Europe Foundation has some project on that, for training, but also for dialogue on that, political dialogue, not only technical one. And I think that that's something which is really an important key issue in the dialogue between Africa and Europe, in order to develop another position that just European preaching for green issues, which is so badly received in Africa for many reasons, but not preaching. It's not a question of preach, it's a question of really common interest and reciprocity. I think that if we try, or we achieve the goal to progressively impose a market with rules and carbon initiative, which is really a benefit for the African countries because of their rich biodiversity, because of their rich capacity to carbon sinks, and etc. I think that it's one tool of the dialogue which has to be used properly. And it's not the case today, because it's really a forest of various initiatives without any, or not any, but not sufficiently regulated. What means that everybody can do what he wants, with also things which are really very, very greenwashing and private interest, not in the common interest. So that's a field that I think that we have to develop in order to create new benefit and new finance for development.
Yeah, thank you very much, Isabel, for raising that point around the importance of the African assets and the carbon initiatives. That is actually quite underpinned as well by digital infrastructure. So that me brings to bring Jane, maybe quickly here, to hear a little bit your perspective, Jane, around the importance of the digital market, I think, around Africa and Europe, and the opportunities it actually presents. So, Jane, over to you.
Good morning. Good morning. Thank you. First, thank you very much to the hosts of this gathering. It's already very impactful, and it is my hope that as we go to the tech side, that we're adding to the conversation, because the conversation has already started. But I want to refocus just a little bit on the tech angle. I know the excellencies and the two youth speakers spoke about tech, which is very important, even as we recast why Europe needs Africa, or as Africa needs Europe. So when I was invited, and thank you, David, for making me part of this project. It's been an honor, and Dr. Zainab. It was important for me also to try and bring the perspective of what is already happening within the African continent. And so I framed this essay, which first looks at building a single digital market. So it's please feel free to read it, but I'll just do a 5-minute overview. Is some of the key things that we need to consider that are already happening within the continent when we talk about a Europe-Africa digital collaboration. First and foremost, we have established that there's already an existing relationship. I mean, Africa and Europe countries already have their own very established relationship, but of late, we've also begun to see that relationship being driven by tech. So there's a strong digital relationship that's beginning to form bilaterally within different countries, and there's also that which is being formed within the African Union based on the African Union Digital Transformation Strategy. So having this background is also key, because they already identified priorities within African countries of what the journey needs to look like. So then now when we look at what is beginning to surface as part of this collaboration, is it beginning to match? Do we see an impactful or fit for purpose collaboration forming? And I think that's where we can add voice to it. I don't want to answer directly, but I think there's opportunity to extend that. And there are a couple of things that also we need to consider within how the tech is reshaping this relationship. One, it has already been discussed heavily within the two youth speakers. We are beginning to see a youth bulge that we've been talking about for the last 20 years. I highlight that in the essay as something at that point I did not know that I would be speaking here today when Kenya is just going through a crisis. Well, I want to say a revolution, because that's what's happening. There's a speaker who spoke about we didn't see this coming. Yes, we saw this coming. It has been happening. I am from Kenya, so I can very much tell you this has been on the precipice for, we've been seeing this is, and I can also dare say that this is more like a smoke signal. We have not seen the end of this. And that is, the youth are becoming more and more, not just in Kenya, but across the entire continent. And they're not just going to start reshaping national, because that's what we've seen now at the national level, but even in these dialogues that we're having between Europe and Africa, we have to get the youth on the table. Her Excellency talked about dialogue, but I also want to add co-creation. I think it's really important that we start having some type of co-creation on this. So in this paper, I talk about the youth and how they can be part of reshaping the Europe-Africa digital collaboration. Secondly, I also highlight the digital transformation itself that's ongoing. Africa today is rife with innovations. A lot of young people are driving this innovation space. We've seen a lot mobile money. We've seen other innovations that if we start naming them, there are multiple across the continent. But what is the key factor here again that we cannot forget? The tech itself and the young people, the innovative, the entrepreneurship. They see it as an opportunity to start defining this space. So then how do we start surfacing that to the collaboration that's happening? And how can we strengthen that when Europe is engaging, or when Africa is engaging with Europe? So at this point, I start saying there is opportunity to start driving this to a more nuanced or a more effective collaboration that looks at building more of a single digital market. And this market has to be driven by interlinkages. We need digital services that are being offered cross-border between the African continent and here. So we also need to start looking at the operational networks that define that. Marta talked about visas and so forth. But even beyond we go to those operation networks that are there, we also have to looking at how does a digital service from Africa get utilized, or how does it come to this continent? Have we even started seeing that? What is the opportunity there? And vice versa. There's a lot of Europe applications right now that are available within the African market. But we are yet to see a more collaboration or opening of markets where African digital services are being, and there are many structural problems there that we have to start engaging on. Secondly, we cannot also start building these markets if the African continent itself is still suffering, or I would say the digital divide is quite large. Look at what the young people have been able to do. And I keep going back to the young people because what happened in Kenya was driven by technology. They were on social media, TikTok. That was we say about 40% of the African continent is connected. Imagine if it was 100%. What would be seen? The opportunities that would be there. So there's opportunity for the Europe-Africa partnership to start focusing on some of the technological aspects. And I think this is key, because when we look at the past partnerships that have been, especially the Team Europe one that I highlight in this, there was a lot of talk about ensuring that there's connectivity. But when you look at the actual collaboration that was signed, there was literally no connectivity part of it in that collaboration, which makes us to wonder, when we can talk here, but when it comes to actual engagement, what is actually happening within the collaborations? It really needs to speak to the realities of where we see the opportunities. And last but not least, I also want to talk about the operational networks and how this can be strengthened. As one who also came from former government, there are many things I would have wanted to put on this paper, but I extended this to a very, but I hope there's more Chatham House rules here. But when some of these partnerships are being developed, there is a tendency also of exporting talent from Europe to African collaboration. So when governments are engaging, we see a lot of consultants. I think that's the word that is constantly used. Yet we have talent within African continents that can also be beneficiaries, or those who are able to drive this collaboration. So I think that's strengthening that of using the local talent, I think, is very important to ensure that we're not just giving support or technology support to bring the ideas and the talent itself when we're not building the local talent that is there. Last but not least, Europe is a big organization. When it comes to the African continent, the discussions happen, but then after that it's bilateral. So I think a more coordinated way of this collaboration, even on the tech side, I think is very, very important. And then finally, I want to say the opportunities are there. I want to go on a positive side. There's opportunities to grow this digital market. And because if Africa continues on the pace it is with the Africa Free Continental Trade Agreement, there's going to be a single digital market when paired with the EU is going to create a lot of opportunities and is going to be mutual enhancement for both continents. So thank you very much. And really a pleasure to be part of this discussion.
Thank you very much, Jane. Thank you also for the optimism and for mentioning the importance of dialogue, co-creation, and actually to close the loop and back to what David mentioned a little bit earlier about this notion of circular cooperation. So I'd like to bring in Hassan, who's joining us online to kind of briefly, very briefly, Hassan, if I may, to kind of touch upon this circular cooperation and what should be actually the next move for this Africa-Europe partnership. So over to you, Hassan.
Yeah, thanks very much. And is the line clear? You can hear me okay?
All good.
Great. Yeah, Hassan Damaluji, co-founder of Global Nation. It was a real honor to be here talking to you today. Thanks for the invite and to contribute a paper to the essay series. So many great points have been made, and I'll try and bring some of them together in what we think is a kind of powerful new way of thinking about what it can mean to partner between Europe and Africa. You know, asking even the question of what's in it for Europe when it comes to development finance to Africa used to be a question that you weren't really meant to ask, right? You know, ever since at least the end of the Cold War, the narrative of development cooperation was one of essentially charity, where you weren't meant to get anything out of it. And of course, you know, the kind of charitable generosity explanation of foreign aid was never an accurate description of the political motivations behind it, but it was the narrative in donor capitals and in the international sphere, and that narrative doesn't work anymore. It doesn't work anymore because Europe doesn't feel as charitable, as it feels that it has plenty of its own problems to deal with, sluggish growth, war on the continent, but also as Africa doesn't want charity anymore. Africa, you know, with its many different peoples and countries, is quite united in the idea that it wants a different kind of relationship that isn't based on some notion of generosity or philanthropy. So that paradigm is gone, but we're still searching for a paradigm of what cooperation can look like when it comes to development finance. And we're told about this partnership of equals, and that's obviously a wonderful expression. That's the right thing, but we haven't really articulated yet what it means. And the search, I think, in Europe for getting something out of it, what's in it for us, I think is leading to two worrying trends. One is to just cut development finance and say, well, there isn't that much in it for us, let's do less of it. And the other is to actually follow the kind of extractive models that we criticize sometimes other development actors for, the same thing that China is criticized for in terms of its goals in Africa. We actually in Europe are saying, no, that's what we should be doing. And some of that is happening, and even to the extent that you have this up until the recent election, this policy in the UK of the relationship with Rwanda, which is based on the UK not following its obligations of human rights when it comes to refugees. This kind of what's in it for us narrative is the one that's in danger of taking over from the charitable narrative, which is already to be discarded. And we propose a different approach. All of the paradigms that have been discussed or certainly enacted are really paradigms that are vertical, that are from to. And this vertical notion has been supplemented in recent years by this concept of South-South, and that's obviously a good thing. But often what's called South-South cooperation is really vertical cooperation, where a country that's deemed South which is still has far more resources than another country that's also deemed south. They cooperate, but still in a very vertical nature. One can think of, Turkey's cooperation with countries in Africa, China's cooperation with certain countries in Africa. It doesn't fundamentally change the direction of travel in terms of we are helping you. And then there's this concept of triangular cooperation, which is again, moving on from the original conception that's very vertical, but fundamentally still sees the high-income country as not having any problems of its own that will be solved by this, and at best, if there are, it's the problem of how to extract. So, what we propose is a different paradigm, that of circular cooperation, one that recognizes that there isn't a hub and a spoke, but actually trying to really make the idea of a relationship of equals real on the ground. And it starts with a fundamental recognition that Europe has development needs. We had in the SDGs this wonderful moment of saying it's not just the Millennium Development Goals where a few poor countries are the ones that need help, but all countries have development needs. We've accepted that in the SDGs, but we haven't in any way translated that into development finance. Although within the EU, this recognition exists. The EU structural funds transfer funding to high-income countries. The EU relationship is not one that's from to, but genuinely trying to level up across the board. We haven't translated that into international development finance outside of Europe. The circular cooperation model says that all countries would contribute. Now, clearly, the ones with more finance would contribute more finance, but it's not only they who contribute. There's lots of different ways of contributing resources, skilled people, other types of resource to the cooperation. All countries benefit. And this is the really revolutionary thing, for European countries to have the humility to understand that they can benefit from these partnerships, not in extracting resources, but actually in learning. And all countries decide, right? The decision-making is not done by a hub, towards a spoke. And I think whilst all of the points that have been made today, I'll finish here, all of the points that have been made today are ones that probably most people in the room and online will agree with. The challenge I think we have in creating this new paradigm of truly circular cooperation and mutual partnership is that lots of people outside this room may not be convinced that really there is value there on both sides, that really Europe has something to benefit in learning from the experience of African countries and people. And I think that is where what we need to do, in answer to your question of what's next, I think we need to generate more evidence. During the COVID response, I was very frustrated by this constant claim of spend billions to get trillions to get people to contribute to COVAX, because it didn't seem believable. Where are these trillions? What trillions? Really, will funding COVAX bring me trillions? So we funded an exercise to actually find out, from an macroeconomics perspective, is how much really European and other high-income countries would gain selfishly by the fact that the 92 COVAX countries were vaccinated. And we found that it was a 12x, not trillions, but a very good return that made smart economic sense in investing in COVAX. Not enough of that type of evidence exists. Not enough real hard economic evidence exists to convince people that, yes, in the discussions we've been having around tech, around visas and all the rest of it, that there are tangible, measurable economic gains that would convince people who aren't already proponents of development cooperation to get involved in this paradigm. And so I think the more we can do that, we can grow the consensus that's already in this room into the parts of the political economy that would be skeptical today. And really excited to work with many of you to do that. So thanks again for the invitation and for allowing me to listen into what was a really great conversation.
Thank you very much, Hassan, and thank you also for reinforcing that notion of reciprocity, that it's actually very crucial as well in this renewed Africa-Europe partnership. Just quickly, I know I'm taking a little bit on our break, and forgive me everyone for coffee break, but I know Nancy has been waiting patiently online, so if I may bring Nancy, thank you. Hi, Nancy, to hear your thoughts on this and bringing the oceans and blue economy angle. Over to you, Nancy.
Thank you very much. And now I have to be between a people and their break, but I'll try to be very, very efficient with time. Thank you very much for bringing me into this conversation and speaking as co-chair of the strategy group on ocean governance. Let me say that we are honored at the opportunity to contribute to the policy setting and priority program for a new phase of Africa-Europe partnership and to feed into the importance and huge potential of a partnership on ocean governance and blue economy, looking at the opportunities that exist to create a transformative and sustainable Africa-Europe partnership for our people. Allow me to start by borrowing from the Pacific Islands maxim that says, the ocean does not divide us, it unites us. Indeed, the oceans and seas connect us as states and regions, making otherwise distant nations neighbors. Africa and Europe indirectly border each other through a roughly 20,000 kilometer of coastline. But as we have seen, while the sea is a rich source of protein, depository of immense wealth in energy and natural resources, much of which are found along or near the coastline, Africa's relationship with the ocean has remained a tragic one for very long because its most dominant aspect is the images that beam into our televisions of the hundreds of Africans who drown trying to reach Europe in rickety, overcrowded, and unsafe boats. Clearly, stability and development are very closely linked to the oceans. And when we speak of these people who try to reach Europe, the youth in Kenya, and has come out in the last, in a few of the speakers who said, in the last few weeks, the youth have spoken, the young people have spoken, and they have said they don't want to migrate. They are not interested in going outside their own country. They want those opportunities right here. And therefore, being in a position to create them, and especially through the blue economy, becomes quite an imperative for us. The deteriorating health of the world's ocean calls for science-based solutions and forward-thinking, holistic approaches to management, and therefore stronger collaboration and partnerships, which will help us realize, one, the environmental protection and sustainable development we need by mobilizing resources, sharing knowledge, promoting the creation and transfer of environmentally sound technologies, as well as development. Africa and Europe are at the vicinity of more than a quarter of the world's largest marine ecosystems, with the livelihoods of an increasingly large number of people being dependent on the equitable, and I underline equitable, management, health, and productivity of coastal and marine areas. Indeed, about half of both Africa and Europe's population live within 100 kilometers of the seaside, with concentrations in urban areas along the coast. And these regions are interfaces of Africa-Europe trade, as well as cultural exchanges, a part of which we've had. And most important, 90% of Africa's imports and exports are transported through the oceans. So the oceans are not only the largest ecosystems in the world, but also a huge economic system. And ocean governance and the blue economy sit at the heart of strong economies, climate change mitigation, and restoration and preservation of biodiversity. And therefore, an African-Europe partnership and collaboration has great potential to yield a wider reservoir of knowledge and research capacities in which are the best tools for management and conservation. In our strategy group, we are working together in partnership and collaboration, and we are proposing driving the transformation of multilateral systems. And one of the major areas of strategic importance is the biodiversity of the oceans, which leads me to speak on the BBNJ, which creates large-scale marine protected areas and seas, and on which we feel that working together as Africa and Europe could drive the much-needed transformation of global multilateral system. And we could start this by the early ratification and early entry into force of the BBNJ. This is because the agreement marks a significant milestone in international cooperation being the first dedicated global treaty on conservation and sustainable use of marine biodiversity of the high seas and the area, and therefore addressing what has been a huge gap in ocean protection, because only about 1% of the high seas is currently protected, and an issue that cannot be allowed to continue. Now, this will help us better balance conservation and sustainable use of marine biological resources, increase coherence, coordination, and synergies among ocean-related activities carried out by many stakeholders and organizations, and therefore contribute to a more holistic management of activities. Let me say that because this is very, very important, and that's why I must emphasize about the collaboration through the blue economy, because unless we take urgent action now, based on the expected increasing human demand for marine resources in the coming decades, for foods, minerals, for biotechnology, there are threats and the very real possibility of exacerbating the problem we are in. Because a healthy, productive, sustainable, and resilient ocean is critical for our planet, for our lives, and our future, and actions to accelerate implementation of the BBNJ are very, very important. So let me say that as the Africa-Europe Strategic Group on Ocean Governance, we have established an inclusive and multidisciplinary experts dialogue platform, which forms a very unique joint exchange and learning platform, advancing a mutually beneficial vision and common priorities for our two continents on ocean policy and action, including on the international stage, and centered on, I'll name a few key areas: governance, multilateralism, and global treaties. And one very important one is capacity sharing through concrete priority areas of focus. And I may name here the fisheries management through data and transparency. And another one is working as partners on science, policy, and data exchange. And most important, identifying possibilities and projects of common interests, beginning, of course, with the marine protected areas and locally managed marine areas. We have a strong platform, therefore, to build closer cooperation between Europe and Africa on ocean governance, of course, riding on existing and recent political commitments and complementing the work already done. And we therefore strongly propose that our strategy group on Africa-Europe relations be recognized as a cross-continental mechanism that demonstrates the ocean governance and blue economy as a strategic domain of cooperation for the African Union, as well as the European Union partnership, and building on opportunities presented by future milestones, including one, our ocean conference, and towards 2025 with the AU-EU summit and the third United Nations conference. We aim to serve the two continents, and our wish is to become a permanent incubator. That's what we are seeking for new strategic and concrete proposals. And of utmost importance is the need to continue to increase the level of understanding and trust between our two continents through sustained exchange, continuous dialogue, and most important, to elevate the ocean and blue economy, both in the political realm and also financially. In order to catalyze new impactful cooperation, it will be very important to continue engagement, regular engagement between the European Commission and the African Union Commission, and to work with champion countries across the two continents. As I conclude, let me add my 2 cents bit on the visa issue, because one of the areas that wasn't mentioned and which is very, very important is the visas for seafarers going to embark ships within the Schengen areas. And when those challenges that came out are mentioned, our 2-month wait for the appointment, the money that is paid, then having to go to other countries for visas, ships can only have a very, very small windows through which the seafarers can join. And therefore, these are not commensurate. And therefore, coming up with innovative solutions to enable these young people who want to work on board ships to be able to traverse will also help. So, Martha, you could add the seafarers issue into your long list of the need for visas. And therefore, let me end by praying that we shall do all we can to ensure that in this conversation, one, we bring, of course, the young people who are our biggest assets that we have, and also ensure that we take advantage of the opportunities that are presented by the blue economy so that we can derive and reap the utmost benefits for the people of our two continents. We have a youth bulge, and we have seen it, we've seen the implosion in Kenya, and these are people for whom the lack and denial of economic opportunities is increasingly being reflected as a denial of democratic space. I thank you all for listening to me. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Nancy, for your intervention. Mindful of time, mindful of the break. So maybe David, one final word? No word from David. So, okay, so thank you very much, everyone. So we'll try, of course, to bring you in for the second sessions. If we could start at 11:30 sharp for the coffee break, so 15 minutes. And then for those who are online, please do use the separate Zoom link for the next sessions. Thanks again, and see you in 15.